verification of skepticism. It has nothing to do with skepticism of the kind that interests us. Because, of course, like most concepts, the concept of skepticism is a sort of play of grammar. It's very large, it has lots of different sub-concepts contained in it, and it's very important, therefore, this, of course, is what philosophy is all about, which is sort of unpacking. Actually, the metaphor of unpacking grammar, I think, is not a very entertaining one, but unpacking the concept anyway, and showing that there are uses of the concept which are very important, and very productive, and others that aren't. And so I think just mentioning in connection with that book, The Reputation of Skepticism, those of us, and I'm sure there are a number of you here in the audience who make our living by being academics, and of course amuses us that people say, oh, we're doing academic, that doesn't matter. But those of us who make a living have to publish serious journal articles, papers, and books which contain lots of long words like and they're only read by about 2 other people who are experts in that field. And in the theory of knowledge in philosophy, this knowledge, one of the very central concerns is how you provide justification for knowledge claims, for propositions that you want to advance, which can be premises in further reasoning, or which can be used as a basis for action. And familiarly, those of you who study philosophy know that we begin course of study of philosophy by inviting our students to think a little bit about what knowledge is and how we get it and how we test it, and we get them to analyse the concept and we get them to see that's a very important component of the quest for knowledge is the justification of the claims we make when we say that we know something. And justification is a deep problem in philosophy and indeed in all our inquiries, because there are skeptical arguments that can be advanced against them. For example, if I say there is a microphone in front of me now, and you ask me how I know that, I say that I can see it, touch it, manipulate it, or microphone, taste it, and so on. So I can use my 5 senses to give me evidence that it's here. Nevertheless, the skeptic is very familiar with the Cartesian skeptic will say, well, maybe you're dreaming or having a nightmare as you're standing in front of an audience in Edinburgh and thinking there's a microphone in front of you. So if you ask the proposition, there is a microphone in front of you, you would be wrong because you're dreaming that there is one. And the right kind of perceptual link with the microphone doesn't exist. Or it might be in this Descartes trick in the Meditations, his famous work, which is a kind of classic introduction to philosophy for people, to say, supposing there were an evil demon whose whole existence is dedicated to fooling people about everything that they could be wrong about, even something as simple as 1 + 5 = 2. What could you not be fooled about? And famously, the one thing that you can't be fooled about, suggested was that I drink, therefore I am. I think therefore I am, whatever it was. Provided in this rock-hard certainty from which you can start to reconstruct the rest of the body of your knowledge. So you might be being fooled that there is a microphone. But these skeptical suggestions, of course, are very outre, they're very unsustainable. You can't make a case for them that's stable and persuasive. But they are sort of tricks in a way that help to show us what work we have to do as epistemologists, to show how we justify our claims to knowledge, or how we can provide roots for our beliefs which will strengthen them. And that is the problem of skepticism in philosophy. And discussion of that problem, the problem of the skeptical challenge to our ordinary beliefs about the work, to our ability to make careful and sensible prognostications about how the work will work, skeptical challenges to the assumptions that we make as we assume a whole range of things, including the regularity and stability of the world order. The world is a stable causal framework which allows us to use past experience to predict and anticipate what might happen in the future. Skeptical challenges to those assumptions and to those beliefs which constitute the framework of our thinking are very, very important. And just another quick remark. Those of you, all of you, were reading Wittgenstein in the bath last night, I know, so you will know that this a very important aspect of Wittgenstein's challenge of philosophy, that most of our thinking in philosophy is based on a number of mistakes. He thought that philosophy is just a result of semantic error. We don't really understand how language works, and therefore we get ourselves into difficulties when we ask questions about the nature of truth, or good, or beauty, or justice, or the right way to live. But then oddly, and this of course was a view that he put forward in aphoristic form in his the work that we think of as his main work, which is called The Philosophical Explications. Quite at the very end of his life, he sort of doubled back on himself, and he started to work on a set of thoughts, aphorisms, which were edited into a book known as On Certainty. And it was a straightforward inquiry into the basis of knowledge, a straightforward attempt to understand the force of skeptical arguments and how we could justify our claims to them. Everything I said so far relates to what's called epistemological skepticism, because there are not syllables in it to be a proper thing that you do university. That's epistemological skepticism. What we're interested in tonight, skepticism of a quite different kind, is the healthy, intellectually hygienic kind of skepticism, which makes us ready always on the point of our intellectual toes, so to speak, to evaluate, to assess, to question, to think clearly about the sorts of things that are said to us by politicians and homeopathists and the snake oil salesmen who surround us everywhere all the time. And in particular, of course, think about the claims made by the great traditional views about the world. Most of them are religious. So to assess these frameworks of thought, which are offered to us by history, by people in our societies around us, to evaluate and assess them according to the canons of a kind of sensible, straightforward skepticism, which is interested in trying either to find the truth, if it is possible to find the truth, which we're going to come back to in a moment, or at any rate, to find a way of thinking about things, an attitude, intellectual attitude to things, which is really robust, for which you can make a case. So if somebody challenges the position that you arrive at on the basis of careful thinking, accumulation of evidence, the application of reason and common sense, if somebody challenges the view that you arrive at, that you can make a very robust case of response. Always, of course, under the government of the principle that everything that we human beings hope we know, or that we believe, or that we want to try and understand is defeasible. Defeasible means could be shown to be wrong, could be shown to be engaged in proof. Better arguments and better evidence might come along and might persuade us to adjust or to change, or even indeed to give up a view and to see things differently. Intellectual integrity, intellectual honesty requires that people always be ready to listen to the argument, to look at the evidence, to be prepared to change their minds if there is a powerful case for doing so. And it's that kind of skepticism in the healthy, inquiring, questioning, scrutinizing sense that I want to talk about tonight. And I should mention in connection with that, we all know the remark, an open mind is tremendously important. One should be open-minded, but not so open-minded that our range falls. We all know that saying. And that's actually a generalized point which applies to everything. It's good to be skeptical, but not so skeptical that you fall into the quicksands of never making a commitment of a certain kind to those views, those propositions which you really can use in further thinking and as a basis for action. Because the framework of our thought and the concepts in our conceptual scheme provide us with our resources for going on to further inquiry, to further discovery, to further assessment of other things that we encounter, other beliefs that people hold, or we ourselves hold, and which need assessment. And so, of course, we are bound to act in the world. We are bound to pause somewhere and say, right, I'm going to take this as sufficiently well justified example, you're a medical practitioner, 3 people are brought into the emergency room, a couple of verbal spots, only at the you've got no idea what's wrong with them, you come up with some very, very bad hypotheses. Say 3 very bad hypotheses about what it is. Whether it's been infected by aliens or some new uncovered disease, whatever. But because you have to act, because there's something you have to do to try and help them, you have to go with the least bad hypothesis. So when you compare the 3 hypotheses and you see that one is marginally more plausible than the other, then the ethics of the higher review that you base your actions on that. And this reflects something which lies very deep in the history of philosophical skepticism and general skepticism, back in classical antiquity. You will know that Plato founded an academy, Fringe, and Plato, by the way, was a massive author of fascism and trouble, and the view of the nature of society, very, very reactionary. And one of the great ironies about Plato is that Socrates, his teacher, the man who went around being skeptical and questioning people and challenging them to investigate the beliefs that they took for granted, that Socrates would not have been possible in Plato's time. He would have been banned or executed very much earlier. So it's a great irony in history. But Plato founded an academy at the university, in effect, which lasted for nearly 1,000 years. It was closed down with all the other schools of Athens by the church, the Christian church, because it's all pagan philosophy and not divine philosophy. It lasted for over 900 years. But very early in its existence, in the 2 or 3 generations after Plato's own time, it became associated with skepticism, 2 forms of skepticism. One of them was called Pyrrhonian skepticism, following the thinking of a man called Pyrrho of Venice. And Pyrrho's argument was that we are in a permanent situation with doubt. We never know for absolute sure. Outside of any range of formal systems like mathematics and logic, we can never know for absolutely sure that things are thus and so or such and such. Therefore, since the arguments on both sides of any proposition, in support of a proposition or against a proposition, since they are of almost equal strength, what we have to do is suspend judgment. And that was the slogan of the Pyrrhonian skeptical outlook. We have to suspend judgment. But from the agnostic But there was another skeptical tradition that said, well, it's true that we may only very rarely ever have complete certainty about it. It may be that our arguments on both sides of our dispute could be of nearly equal strength. But they noticed 2 things. That sometimes it's not the case that the arguments are of equal strength. For example, the argument that there's an earthquake currently now, the evidence that I could give of the reasonable considerations that could deduce in favour of that proposition are much stronger and more plausible than the ones that say that I'm now having a nightmare, I've been on the Fringe in Edinburgh, and so on and so on. And therefore, the preponderance of evidence suggests that it would be reasonable, in fact, better than reasonable, it would be rational for me to conclude that there is an outcome in that. So that's one thing they noticed. The other thing they noticed was, we live in a world of commitments. Other people have duties and responsibilities, neighbours, parents, brothers, voters, workers, and so on. We have to act, and we have to act by our best minds. And therefore, we have to look at what we think, what we believe, what assumptions we're making. And we have to go with the best, the ones that we can really justify and make a case for. Because it's a pragmatic consideration how we do things. And so those skeptics said we've always got to go with the strongest arguments for the best evidence until we're shown otherwise. And that kind of skepticism, not the skepticism which kind of stalls us in a sort of agnosticism about everything, but the more reasonable kind of skepticism is the kind that I think we're talking about here and that we share. But even though it is more reasonable, even though it is perhaps actually what most people operate in the course of their ordinary lives anyway, somebody comes up to a bus stop, their usual familiar bus stop, and their town or city happens to be in the same situation that Edinburgh is at the moment with its traffic organisation. They might find that there's a plastic bag over the bus stop that says bus stop suspended. So it would be irrational of them to stand there and look at the really involve the sort of reasonable skepticism that people have about the world. You might ask, is this a joke? Because you put this here, because it's the festival, something to drunk or something tobacco, or could it be a real indication that the route has been changed? Those sorts of questions that go through people's minds. And they are very characteristically skeptical questions, because they are evaluating evidence, making judgment on the basis of that evidence. So that's the kind of skepticism that we're talking about. And that kind of skepticism, when we explain to people that we're skeptical about political claims, or about religious claims, or about the interpretations that paleoanthropologists put on feudal bones and skulls that they find in the East African sand, about all the different species of human beings, whatever it might be, whatever the subject matter is, and we're skeptical about it, what we mean is that we want to be able to think more clearly, have better understanding of the evidence, and see what we can consistently infer from it, and what it would be reasonable to be based on. That kind of skepticism. And when we say to people about that kind of skepticism, we say to them that we rely on reason and on evidence. And it's those two concepts, the concept of reason, the concept of evidence, that I'd like to say something about it, because they are each of them parallels. And they really are hugely full of a lot of different other ideas or implicit concepts, because they're not univocal concepts, they're not just one thing, it's not just one thing which is reason. There is reasoning, styles of reasoning which are appropriate to subject matter. And the way that you do research in biochemistry, the way you do research in history, the way you research what we're seeing at the Fringe, the way you navigate your way around your hometown, they all involve styles of reasoning. But and although there are overlaps between them, nevertheless they are specific to subject matter, specific to domain. And reasoning, although there are some things common to all forms of reasoning, some demands, for example, that have to be met every time you reason. For example, the demand for consistency, that you don't need to competing things at the same time. It's just a simple enough principle. Nevertheless, the range of things that people do when they reason will be very much influenced by the subject matter on which they reason. If you think about it, when we reason, when we talk about reasoning about something, we're thinking about it. We're trying to work something out. We're trying to understand something. We're trying to compare, contrast, draw inference, make use of appropriate and relevant assumptions that will help us to interpret something, so there's an interpretative aspect to it. We're trying to look at consequences. We're trying to see whether, if we thought this about this situation, what would follow, if we thought something else, what would follow. We're trying to look to see which one of the two or more trains of consequences would be more desirable, whether any of them are in competition with one another. In other words, we're doing a huge number of things when we reason, when we think reasonably about something. And you can see immediately that the subject matter, the content of the reasoning process, will have a big influence on what counts for us as the reasonable judgment that we place on that process, or that comes out of that process. So, for example, if you're thinking about the past, in the absence of an H.G. Wells time machine, you can't go back in the past to verify hypotheses about what happened in the past by direct perceptual experience, for example. I mean, supposing somebody proposed that Elizabeth I and Sir Walter Raleigh were lovers, and there are no diary entries, saw the body last night, no love letters, dear Lizzie, dear body, and you've got no H.G. Wells time machine, so you can't go back and hide the backstairs, kitchen stairs, and have the court to see living up. So there's no evidence. And therefore, we have the problem, is this proposition true or false, determinately, even though nothing counts as a possible decider between them? Or is it a truth value, this proposition, kind of neutral from the point of view of its truth value? If we thought that it had a definite truth value, then assigning one or other of those truth values should make it should make a difference to other things that we get. What happened to Walter Raleigh in his account of the world, why he was in the Tower of London and so on. But if we thought it was false to live with others, then we need to think differently about those other things. If we thought it was neutral as to true fact, it was neither true nor false, there was nothing else as evidence for it, then what role would it play in other kinds of things? Perhaps none, perhaps it becomes irrelevant. So you see in the historical case, you have a problem about what you think about a certain proposition and what work that proposition might do. Contrasted to the kind of case where you have a medical practitioner faced with a puzzling patient, or a science researcher or rather the scientific disciplines where you're thinking about how to construct an experiment and control for various disturbing factors that have influence the outcome. So the subject matter is crucial. And it's no surprise, therefore, that when we talk about the use of reason, we have this cognate idea of people being reasonable, that is, of being sensitive to the fact that whatever they do in constructing their reasoning process and their testing of hypotheses, that they have to be reasonable. And what we mean by that is that they have to be rational. The idea of rationality is the one that doesn't work for us here, because the first part of that word, ratio, means a proportion. A proportionality between the evidence and the reasons that you have for thinking something and the thing that you think. The degree of strength lent to something that we want to say or propose or believe by the evidence that we have and the reasons that we want to use. So rationality is the proportion of evidence and reasons. And this is a very key point. It's a very key point because it bears on questions, for example, about the existence of God, let's say. Proponents of religious outlooks, theists, I often say, well, you can't prove that there isn't a God, as if that were enough to justify believing that there is God. And they're wrong about that, because you can prove it. And then to explain to them why requires that you point out that the concept of proof itself and its relation to rationality is the key issue. Proof in a formal system like logic or branches of mathematics is a matter of deduction. It's a matter of explicating, taking out of the premises that you have for an argument, the information, rearranging it. It's very, very interesting that deductive inferences, which provide us with conclusive proofs in formal systems, actually contain no novelty in them. There's no logical novelty in them at all. Because in abstractive argument, all the information which constitutes the conclusion is already in the premises. All men are mortal, Socrates is a man, Socrates is a mortal. But you can see that the information in the conclusion is already there in the premises, and the act of deducing the conclusion is an act of rearranging the information. This is why in particular movies you see the detective poring over the evidence, trying to rearrange it to see where the conclusion is. Sometimes hear from doctors that if they take a careful enough history, the patient will tell them what the disease is, because it's all there implicit in the premises that they have. But although there's no logical novelty in deduction, there can be psychological novelty. There's a story told about a weekend party held by some French duke. There was a duke in his chateau in Rouen, and the guest of one night was the cardinal. And at a certain point in the party, the duke has to go down to the basement to get a couple of bottles of champagne and a couple of bottles of drinking. And he leaves the cardinal to entertain the other guests. And the cardinal does so by saying to the other guests, you know, I've known the duke for ages. In fact, he's the very, very first person who ever came and gave confession, whose confession I heard when I was first ordained. And then the duke reappears, clutching the bottle, checking it out. He claps the cardinal on the shoulder and he says, you know, I've been in the cardinal for so long, I was the very, very, very first person who made confession. But the key to the story is that while the duke was absent, the cardinal was telling the assembled company about the duke, about his first experience of confession. He said at another point in the evening, when I was a very young do a first at the expense of giving a confession. The person who confessed to me is a vile, multiple murderer. So it puts everybody in the party of not sufficient confidence in checking that about not being able to deduce that this was the Duke and they all left. So there's no logical novelty, but there was a lot of psychological novelty in the production of this. And this is very often the case with productions, that we learn something from them because we didn't see the pattern of the arrangement of information included in the premises. Quite by contrast, the sort of reasoning that we most of us use most of the time in our daily lives, in our scientific work, in our other activities, is non-deductive reasoning, or inductive or amputative reasoning, where the evidence that we have, the premises we have, underdetermine the conclusion. You know, the classic case is this one's right, that's one's right, that's one's right, therefore all swans are right. You know, that's false, that's swans in Australia, and the roots started perhaps in the zoo here rather than Canada. So that the amputative form of reasoning is always at risk of being wrong, because the conclusion always has more information, claims more than is contained in the premises. Of course, there are many different kinds of deductive inference, argument by analogy, argument by simple enumeration, causal arguments, and so on. But they have this shared feature, which is that we are always taking a kind of intellectual risk when we reason using it. And since that's the form of reasoning that occupies us in our daily lives and in our working lives, we are always under the necessity of remembering the feasibility, remembering that our reasonings could be wrong. So that's reasoning. Reasoning is many, many different things. Reasoning is about trying to be as rational as possible, that is, proportioning the evidence and the grounds that we have to the conclusions we enable the beliefs that we hold. And there is a very, very stern responsibility on us to be rational, never to go in the face of the best evidence that we have. Let me give you an example. If you were to think, well, our great David Hume has taught us that however many times the sun has moved past doesn't guarantee it's going to rise tomorrow morning, it's just an impact of inference. You know, there's a version of it that Bertrand Russell was keen on, which is the chicken, which got fed every day and was protected, and that's time in the by thought, things get better and better, until the day it turned up it roasted the Sunday dinner. So there's an example of how past evidence is no guarantee that things are going to continue in the future. So you might think, well, every time I've been out in the rain, I've got better. But it's only an inductive inference that the next time I'm in the rain without an umbrella, I will get better. So, having read the Hume, knowing about Russell's chicken, I would bother to take an umbrella with me next time it's raining, because I'm not going to get better. Now, anybody who has reasoning with us, they would think we would be irrational. We're not being rational, we're not proportioning past evidence to the judgment that we make. And that is a classic case, however simple it is a classic case of what rationality means. So that's the reasoning part. The evidence part of it is more complicated. But perhaps just before I leave the reasoning part, I have to point something else out as well, which is that being reasonable, being rational, reasoning correctly, requires us not only to be attentive to how we move from premises to a conclusion, and how we go from the evidence and the reasons given us, or the arguments given us, to a good conclusion, but it also requires us to be very careful in evaluating the premises from which we start. There's a very characteristic thing about a certain kind of psychopathology in which psychopaths start from really weird premises and then by impeccable logical steps arrive at a really weird conclusion. There's sort of what happens with religious reasoning. I mean, all you have to do is go to a faculty of theology and listen to a lecture or read a theology paper, and you will see some impeccable reasoning going on. But of course, it started from premises which no rational person would be much inclined to accept. And therefore, one has to remember that logic by itself is no guarantee that the outcome is going to be a rational outcome. There has to be a very scrupulous, very defensible evaluation of the premises from what's the reasonable agreement. That applies both to the deductive and the non-deductive cases. So that's a very, very important thing to remember. And it bears on the second question, the question of evidence. Because we pride ourselves that we're skeptics, that we try to think carefully, that we're scientists in particular, that we feel as the best practice in the natural and social sciences requires of us, that we be very, very scrupulously attentive to the evidence that we accumulate when we are making observations or when we're constructing an experiment to test an hypothesis. We have to think very carefully about what evidence is. And of course, in the nature of law, the criminal and civil cases, both the question of evidence, the question of corroboration of evidence, the question of admissible evidence, and what even counts as evidence, and most of all, what counts as relevant evidence, both in the court of law and in the science of law, are all very, very important questions. And there is a very simple piece of logic which explains it. This is why this is here. I didn't write that down yet. Well, exciting to do that, so well, wasn't it? The paradox of the Grayling. Anybody ever heard of that? Yes, you know the paradox of the Grayling. Grayling are birds, as you know, and they're black birds. So you might, if you were a student of logic, know that there is a quantified expression which goes as follows. Or as the dictionary is pronounced, for anything whatever, call it X. If it is a Grayling, if X is a Grayling, then X is black. That arrow there stands for if then, right? So it's a hypothetical proposition. So anything whatever, if X is a Grayling, then X is black. Now, I could spend the rest of the hour showing you truth tables and so on to prove the logical equivalence between that statement and what's called its contrapositive. That's when you take the first part of the statement, which is known as the antecedent, and you switch it with the second part of the statement, which is known as the consequent. And when you do that, when you switch the implication around, you get what's called the contrapositive, and it looks like it. Where this sign stands for not. So the contrapositive of the first statement says, for anything whatever, call it X. If it is not black, then it is not a Grayling. So, for anything whatever X, if X is a Grayling, then it's black. So anything non-black is not a Grayling. That's logic. Or they say in London, that's logic in English. That's logic, right? And this is the contrapositive. And it illustrates in a very, very, very simple, direct way what the problem is with evidence. Because if you take the contrapositive of any proposition, then you've got a whole huge body of data available to you without ever getting out of bed, which will confirm for you or be supporting evidence for something that you want to believe. So I can look at the paper. That's not black, so it's not a Grayling. So that confirms that all Graylings are black. The whiteness of this paper confirms that all races are black. The brownness of the table confirms that all races are black. And so on and so on. We're infinite, the potentially infinite number of pieces of evidence that can't be right. What it is, some cases are absolutely very cool. Surely it cannot be relevant trying to establish that Graylings are black, that any non-black things are not real. Because that just gives us far too wide a domain of putative evidence for supporting the proposition. What we want is something much more directly relevant to supporting the proposition. We need to know what counts as relevance in evidence. And this is a very, very key issue. It's a key issue because there are other ways of thinking, also illustrated, by the way, by very, very simple understandings of the underlying logic of it. For example, the other thing we were reading about last night was Karl Popper, Conjectures and Verifications. where he advances his an interesting one, a fantastic one, that's quite a powerful suggestion, that what actually happens in science is that people advance a conjecture or a hypothesis, and then they seek for ways to refute it or to falsify that conjecture. And that if they construct an hypothesis, and the hypothesis entails certain consequences, but you don't get those consequences, then you can take that as a falsification of your proposition. The magicians among you, she's gone to sleep now, she's probably the rest of you myself. The magicians among you will recognize this now. She's known as modus ponens. If P then Q is your first premise, P, hooray, is your second premise, from which it follows Q. Right? Now, there is a form of a couplet of this argument known as modus ponens, which looks like it. If P, then Q, but not Q, therefore not P. It's very, very simple. Most people, by the way, a lot of fragment symbols. I think that logic is that they simplify. I give examples to my students when I say, I point out to them that you might have P might stand for it's raining, and Q might stand for the streets are wet. So, if it's raining, then the streets are wet. And if we look out the window, it is indeed raining, from which it follows that the streets are wet. Down there it says, if it's raining, then the streets are wet. You look out of the window, the streets are dry. You can conclude that it's not raining. Now, it's that second form of argument, modus ponens, the one at the bottom, that Popper spotted, and he said, this is a way of advancing science, advancing scientific discovery. We put forward an hypothesis, conjecture, P. We see what would be the case if the conjecture were had a chance of being right, but if it doesn't turn out that way, then the conjecture is wrong. We have to revise it or come up with a better one. So that's known as falsification, that process. But you can see that that has only had a chance to work. By the way, it is a controversial one, and of course there's always arguing about these things, but it's only viable as a subject to discuss if Q, that is the evidence, and not Q, which is the countervailing evidence, really is evidence, it really is relevant to determining whether or not P might or might not be the case. So evidence, crucially, essentially, fundamentally, involves us in trying to understand what's relevant. When I think about it, suppose you get a rush of blood to the head, you decide that you want to be a kind of zoologist, you want to be important Nobel Prize winning discoveries about the sex lives of frogs, so you go and you sit by a pond and you watch the frogs. And in the distance there's a motorway and there's a kind of murmur. People feeling the traffic management schemes in Edinburgh. And there's just a murmuring noise in the distance. And the question you have to ask yourself is, does the presence of traffic lights in the distance affect the romantic lives of the frogs? Is it relevant to take that into account? Would you, in your observations of different activities by the frogs, should it take into account the difference in the volume of traffic noise coming from the distance? Is it relevant? How do you decide? Well, the answer, of course, is one that's given by pragmatics. It's an answer which is given by trying to account for all the variables that might be influential in a particular case and to discount for them, take them into account and see whether they co-vary with any other phenomena, rule out those that seem to have no relevance, not to be relevant, settle on a pattern of relevance, and then rely on that pattern to try to see whether the evidence in question confirms or infirms, disconfirms the hypothesis in question. But it's a very, very key matter, the nature of evidence, and the nature of the relevance of evidence. In the courts of law, part of the way in which decisions are made about the pervasive force of evidence will depend upon whether there are independent lines of evidence available, whether two lines of evidence will support one another. The recent very, very exciting discoveries that announced that CERN, for example, the Large Hadron Collider, relied on two different major experiments, the compact muon solenoid experiment and the Atlas experiment, looking in quite different ways for the evidence that might suggest that there is the Higgs boson at a certain energy level. And because they were looking in quite different ways for the same phenomenon, when they agreed in their results, they provided one another with corroboration, confirmation that something significant had been seen. Had there been only one experiment, or had they, with the two experiments, come up with very different results, it would have left open the question whether indeed there was a particle at that energy level with those properties. And so you can see that the question of evidence and the question of relevance of evidence is crucial. So what about our ordinary reasoning? What about when we're evaluating what a politician says or what a religious missionary says to us about the claims that they make? Well, there are some cases, of course, where that is a pretty clear cut. I don't know whether you know this, you could admit wrongly is a Mormon. I don't know whether you know that if you're a very, very, very good Mormon, when you die, you get your very own planet with God. And you know, this is really, there's some pretty weird religion there. Well, so if you thought to yourself, now I don't wrongly believe that, which is now, or he doesn't believe it really, which we can, which is a hypocrite. So which do you want? You want a madman or a hypocrite as a president? Actually, most reasonable people would say, it could be the hypocrite any time, because they would be much more useful to the master. The real one is that he actually does believe it, that's what I'm saying. And in a case like that, there's no great contest really. You look at the claims that are made, you look at the evidence which is offered. What is the evidence? The evidence for the claim that the Mormons make is this. Back in the 1820s, a farmer by the name of Smith found two gold plates on his farm in upstate New York. Written on them were ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics. He couldn't translate them, so an angel appeared, an angel called Moroni, not too pronounce it, and translated these ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics into what is now known as the Book of Mormon, which is a kind of pastiche to the 19th century made-up Bible. Now that's the evidence for the claim that if you're a very good Mormon, you get your own planet. And that God, sort of the number one God in the Mormon pantheon, was himself, of course, always a broken in these religions, was himself a human or had material form before becoming God, in a way you read it as well. Footnote, most brand new religions, like the one that David Mackey came up with. Remember David Mackey? He was a sports journalist, and he refused to fly anywhere. And somebody asked him, why are you afraid of flying? He said, I'm not afraid of flying, I'm afraid of crashing. Which actually is quite a rational thing to say when you think about it. But he suddenly found that he was a prophet of God. And like most new prophets of God, he found that he could have 4 wives. It's a very difficult thing, you know. But in the case of Skeptics and his gold plates, that's the evidence that we have for evaluating the proposition. But when you die, if you're very Mormon, you get your own planet. Well, I was told by a friend of mine, Felipe Fernandez Ernesto, that he was sitting next to a Mormon at dinner in Boston a year or two ago, a very hungry Mormon who was busy eating. And Felipe said to him, with great respect, he said, which I would be, but he said, with great respect, your religion, Mormonism, all that stuff about the golden plates and everything, that seemed rather implausible. So Felipe was operating the skeptical principle of talking about the evidence. So it does seem to be rather implausible. And Mormon kept on eating, just saying through the mouthful or whatever it was, he just said, it won't seem implausible in 1,000 years' time. Which of course is the story of religion. So they have a classic kind of case where, but when you think about amphiative reason, that's the inductive reason, the reason that goes beyond the evidence that you have, it's tremendously important to look at the evidence, obviously we all know that, but to be conscious of the nature of relevant to establishing a claim. And it's very interesting to notice in the case of the Mormon appeal to its scriptures found in the 1820s, that they are not relevant, really, to the claim that you, when you die, if you're very good, obedient Mormon, you get your own planet to leave the body. It's not relevant to it because that claim contains very, very much more than could be substantiated by an alleged discovery in the scripture. It has a claim about planets, and a claim about the nature of gods, about the individual rewards that are given to certain sorts of people. These are all what are sometimes called extra theoretical considerations that need other sorts of evidence. The scriptures themselves have made assumptions about that evidence. They made assumptions that the fact that there are planets, that's a very reasonable one. They made assumptions about surviving our bodily deaths on this planet, or being transformed into some other kind of material object, which is the normal state we are. A whole range of assumptions about a set of other things that are required. This shows us how to deal with Pascal's region. Remember Pascal? Who said, even if there's only a tiny probability, but one probability that there is a God, it's worth believing in and obeying the injunctions said to be made by this deity, because if it turns out to be true, then you've got hope of eternity as your reward. If it turns out to be false, where you have lost much of a few, time of hell or something. That was his argument, that you've got more to gain by believing than to lose by not believing. And in fact, of course, he's wrong. When you think about the considerations I just advanced, you see that that's wrong, because it's not just that you have to rest your case on this tiny probability that there is a deity. You need a lot of other assumptions as well. That there is a heaven, that there is survival of bodily death, that there is eternity, that somehow other you're conscious doing, and so on and so on. In other words, you have to accept a whole variety of things which are relevant to the judgment that you base on the primary claim, and that judgment, of course, is very subject. So the question of relevance in evidence, the nature of evidence, and how the evidence bears on some claim, whether it's strong enough to be the rational basis for accepting that claim, is crucial. And because there are so many things that we think, so many beliefs that we have, so many different actions that we have to perform during the day, you cannot provide any more of a general statement about relevance and the nature of evidence than what I've already given you. And because it is so general, because there are so many different specific cases where we're trying to be reasonable, trying to be rational, trying to evaluate the evidence, you have to leave it up to the good sense and the intellectual integrity of each individual faced with a particular demand to be reasonable and to arrive at a reasoned judgment on a given case to those cases. It has to be done on a case-by-case basis. But there will be this overall, as it were, character or property of the reasonable life, of the person who is careful and judicious and thinks about things. And that will be that a certain kind of hesitance, a certain kind of pause will accompany every act or decision or choice, will preface every action that the person takes on the basis of the judgment made. But also, that person will be the kind of person who from time to time sits down and reflects, looks at assumptions being made, looks at decisions, looks at beliefs, and evaluates them. Quite often in London, you come across the London Catholics, probably on visits to that city, and you'll know that they're all highly qualified philosophers. And but when they ask me what I do, and I say I teach philosophy, I don't say I am a philosopher, by the way. Aristotle was a philosopher, so was Immanuel Kant, so was Descartes. So if you say that you are one, I say, oh, well, I'm going to read a script or something like that. And if you're not in the same group, better not to pay for. So I'd say I teach philosophy. And of course they assume that means you are. So then after a pause, while they think, what the hell does a philosopher do when they get up in the morning? I mean, they look at the prime and ask the doctor, what is a philosopher? Actually, it's true, we agree with it. So then they ask you a question, right, meaning of life is. They think they've got it now. I always say to them, I know the answer to that. But I don't tell them. I say, you want to know what it is? They say, yeah, what is the meaning of life? And of course I say, what's true, that is, the meaning of life is what you make it. And that there will be meaningful, significant, deep, and wonderful lives for each of us according to our talents for making and living good lives, if we are thoughtful, and if we are honest thinkers, if we challenge ourselves about our assumptions, if we look at the beliefs that we were given by our society or by our parents, if we look afresh at the world and try to make some sense of it, because the great aim, really, in the end of all our inquiries is to be able to live good and flourishing lives that have good effects on other people. And that really requires self-understanding, and self-understanding requires being informed. And so that process, the process of thinking about how one lives, is the same process as what applies to anything else that runs on. A certain kind of vitamin to cure all ills, or that your politicians are right about some proposal they make. All those statements invite from us a response to be considered, to be thoughtful. And that is what Socrates asked us to do. You may remember in the early dialogues of Cato, we get a portrait of Socrates saying to people, the considered life, the life reflected upon, the chosen life, the life where you try to be as reasonable, as rational as you can, is truly a life worth living. Because a life which isn't considered, which is not rational, which is not based on ideas of reason and evidence and proportionality, that is the life lived according to other people's beliefs and other people's choices. We were trying to football being kicked around by them. But if we're going to try to impose some structure on our own lives, moving towards goals and values that we really believe in, then we've got to think. You remember, I'd like to quote Bertrand Russell on this, what Bertrand Russell said about thinking. He said, most people would rather die than think than most people do. And so this is a great tragedy of humankind in a way. If people are not sufficiently skeptical in the right kind of way, in the positive, intellectually hygienic way, where they're asking themselves, what are the reasons? Are they good ones? What's the evidence? Is it really relevant? Does it really amount to something persuasive? So, as you do to your friends and colleagues, when you commend skepticism to them, I of course